International Affairs Fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations, here to help us explain the dispute between Google and China. Take us back to last week. What happened?
Well, what happened last week is that Google made the unusual step of letting the world know that they had been hacked, probably by the Chinese or agents affiliated, groups affiliated with the Chinese government, and that the target had been not only information on Chinese dissidents who use Google's products like Gmail, but also their intellectual property and the intellectual property of up to 33 other groups in the latest report.
What could the end result of that, for Google, what could that the end result, is that they take their business entirely out of China?
That's what they're threatening to do. Google has, for 3 years since 2006, been in China and allowed the Chinese to restrict access to Google search terms that they find objectionable. Tiananmen Square, June 4th, Tibet, the Dalai Lama, things like that. And Google has said they will no longer do that beginning immediately.
So for viewers, and most everybody uses Google every day here in the U.S. and around the world, Google has different sites for different countries around the world. Are other countries able to say to Google the same sorts of things? We want to have this much input into what sort of content you can deliver to users in that particular country, say the UK or France or any other country where Google may have a presence?
There are other countries that will restrict very limited search terms, like in France and Germany. They'll restrict things like searching for Nazi propaganda, or on the eBay auction site buying Nazi paraphernalia like swastikas. So that it is a common practice in other countries other than the United States to have some restriction. I think few countries have made the kind of investment that China has made in restricting their citizens' access to the internet and restricting freedom of information into their country.
Even though that access is restricted, this one of a number of pictures from late last week about Chinese not protesting, but certainly showing some sympathy for Google there. How is Google viewed by most of the Chinese there?
China's got about a third of the total search market in China. There's a local Chinese search company, Baidu, that gets the majority of Chinese traffic. But the Google tends to attract wealthier, better educated, more influential middle-class Chinese in the major urban areas. And so Google leaving the country will be a major loss for them because they rely on it to get more information through Google than they can through Baidu or other companies that tend to be more in line with the Chinese Communist Party's interests.
We're going to open up our phone lines, and of course you can tweet us a comment, twitter.com, 202-737-0002 for Democrats, 202-737-0001 for Republicans and Independents and others. It's 202-628-0205. We will get to your calls momentarily. So what's the next step for Google? What's the next logical thing that is supposed to happen here?
Google and China and the Chinese government are currently trying to figure out what the next steps are, since Google has opened up their google.cn website and is no longer restricting the search terms. More information has been allowed into China. That's contrary to Chinese law. So right now there's a discussion going on privately between Google and the Chinese government as to whether or not they will be able to maintain that site and maintain any presence in China at all, since they are unwilling to filter their search results any longer. That's the next play for Google in China.
In terms of the U.S. government response, this article from Saturday's newspaper about comments late Friday that the U.S. plans to issue official protest to China over the attack on Google. In the article, they write that the State Department planned action coincides with a speech on internet freedom that Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton is to deliver on Thursday. She is expected to allude to the incident. Quote, when she talks about this issue, China will be one of the countries she points to, an administration official said. How important is this speech and the administration's action going to be?
I think there are two separate issues here, and really the Google-China incident illustrates both of them. One is the issue of Chinese internet censorship and the United States' position in regard to that. The other is the issue of Chinese espionage, particularly economic espionage targeted at countries. So the State Department's first response, the démarche, is going to simply ask for an explanation of the hacking. Can you help us understand how this happened? Can you help us understand why it happened? And can you help us understand who carried out that? What Secretary Clinton will also do next week is make an announcement about how the State Department is going to sponsor internet freedom initiatives, how we can, through aiding and abetting human rights organizations and internet freedom organizations, help Chinese dissidents and other dissidents in Iran, in North Korea, and elsewhere gain access to the internet.
I wanted to give folks an idea of just some background on Google that was founded in 1998 by Larry Page and Sergey Brin. The chairman of the board is Eric Schmidt, who was also an advisor to President Obama. Incorporated in September of 1998. It also has annual revenues of some $5.94 billion. How much of that income comes from their China operation?
Very little, about 1%. They have about 300 million, I believe, market share in China. That's not that significant. What is significant is that China is now the largest internet market in the world. They have 360 million internet users, and that number will double over the next decade, if not sooner. So by leaving this market, while right now it's not a big part of China's revenue, it is a big part of the internet revenue that they can expect in the future. They also are putting at risk the potential billions that they could make in China on their phone market with their new Android platform.
Let's hear from viewers and listeners. Detroit Charlie, good morning. Democrats line for Robert Kanaki. Hi there. Detroit, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Oh, good morning. Good morning,
Good morning.
and good morning, guest. Google is basically a search engine. Search engines make their revenue with advertisements. Searching in China is different from searching in India or searching in United States or in Europe. It has a base of what the searchers want to know. In China, they're not interested in your founding fathers, Columbus discovered America, or pilgrims came from freedoms. They want to know 1.3 billion Chinese. They want to know what they want to search in relation to their culture, their circumstances. So you young man, they're sitting there trying to bring the Cold War phenomena of divide and rule, communists and capitalists, freedoms and restrictions, so on and so forth. They don't work. Please grow up. It is 21st century.
We'll get a response. Thanks for the call.
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that technically Google was operating its own site within China. Google.cn, the CN is for China, it's the Chinese National Domain Registry. The reason they chose to do that in 2006 was because the Google.com website that most Americans will go to when they want to search something was often being blocked or censored. So they went into China and they worked with the Chinese government to establish the Google.cn domain, and they've been targeting and tailoring their content to the Chinese market. And I think that they have become fairly successful at doing that, particularly within a coveted demographic elite that's got money to spend that can respond to their advertising.
Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, Mahogany, go ahead. Democrats line. Hi there.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
I've been listening since early this morning with the Martin Luther King Day. I've been trying to get in touch with you guys. Thank you for accepting my phone call. I basically just wanted to ask, because I do online school, I basically wanted to ask, how do we know that Google is the only search engine that they have access to? How do we know that they haven't, clicked into something else or hacked into something else? And because we released information that we got information so early, they know better than to mention anything, or they know better to say certain things to us to inform us. There's Twitter, MySpace, there's Tag, there's so many search engines that so many kids, young kids, older kids, elderly people that we all go into, and we try. I know I pay my bills, everything overline. Like, how do I know that that's going to be safe?
I think you mentioned that China's largest search engine is another company, Baidu.
Yes. Yeah, I think what the caller is asking really is, did the Chinese hacking, did the espionage attempt target any other companies, and are other online sites like Twitter safe to use, Facebook safe to use, and is Google safe to use? And I think the answer to that is, we know that in this hacking attempt, yes, there were at least 20, possibly up to 30 other companies that were targeted. The reason we know this is when Google found out they were being hacked, they hacked back, and they got onto a server in Taiwan that had information on it that had been exfiltrated not only from Google, but from Dow Chemical, from Lockheed Martin, from an American think tank, from an American law firm, and from other companies. So this incident, yes, it is fairly widespread. More broadly, there is a consistent and evolving problem on the net of infiltration and insecurity. It's not that easy to secure these systems.
And I'm reading a report that's exposed some problems with Internet Explorer in this attack, correct?
Yes, that's true. What the attackers did was they used a previously unknown vulnerability, what's called a zero-day threat. I'm sorry, a zero-day vulnerability, to carry out their attack, so that there was an error in the coding of Internet Explorer that nobody else knew about, that Microsoft didn't even know about, and they used that like a doorway into these systems.
I'm going to ask our producer to bring up, if we can bring up the Google site in China. This is google.cn. So here in the United States, we're able to see this site, and I believe he has typed in Falun Gong into the search box. So we here in the United States can actually look at the Google China site and compare side by side, type in search items in the google.com, the domain we see, and also the one in China, and see the differences here. But the Chinese cannot see google.com in China, correct?
That's correct, yes. There are ways to get around. China has built what some people call the Great Firewall of China. Essentially, they've taken their portion of the internet and secured it at the borders so they can filter the content going in and out and limit it. And then within their borders, they've allowed things like google.cn, which they can directly control, or instead of eBay, they've got a local auction site called Alibaba. And so that way they're able not only to stop content from getting in, but also to control the content that's produced domestically.
Let's go to Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and good morning, Marie, on our Independence line.
Good morning. Good morning, America. How are you? I think we need to be very careful about talking about spying and censorship of China when we have that in our own country by our very own government. Witness the aid of Verizon and AT&T phone companies in the spying upon Americans due to the Patriot Act, weirdly named. I think it's the most unpatriotic act ever passed. Also, the silencing of the press in our country on the war in Iraq. Witness the protest, millions of us out in the streets, and our press was afraid to cover it. Any criticism of our government at that time was totally silenced. Also, we should be careful of Google's reputation. What took them so long? They've been going along with this. Is it because they got caught pirating books?
Marie, thanks for the call. She asked, what took them so long?
I think what took them so long is they had done a 3-year experiment in China to decide if they could make that market compatible with their company values. I think this was essentially the last straw for them when they realized the Chinese government was not only censoring their public, but was also breaking in to companies like Google that have been cooperating with them to steal information so that they can further repress dissent within their country. And I think that Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google, he's from a family of people who fled the Soviet Union because they were being persecuted for their religion. So I think he has been, in many ways, the moral compass of Google, and I think he pressed very hard to say, okay, this experiment is not working. I think Google can be defended for going in originally. I think the 3 years that Google has been there, though they have restricted some searching, a lot more information has been made available through Google than through any other website or any other web portal into China. So there is a degree to which if Google is completely forced out of the country, there will be a loss for the Chinese people.
Didn't Yahoo a couple of years ago, Jerry Yang in particular, come under some heat for cooperating with the Chinese in terms of business practices in China?
They did, and in fact, Yahoo turned over search records that led to the arrest and imprisonment of a Chinese dissident, and they were heavily criticized for doing so. Yahoo has since sold their stake in Yahoo China to another company within China. They maintain some investment in that, but Yahoo's no longer directly in China in that auction market because of that incident. And Yahoo has stepped up and been one of few companies to support Google in this protest against the Chinese.
And as we go to our next caller, give viewers a look at and listeners a reading of comparisons of the two top search engines in China, Baidu and also Google, by revenue. Baidu with some 63% of the 63% of the revenue, Google with 33%, Baidu 62% of searches, Google 14%, and you can see some of the other searches far well below that. Let's hear from Mountain View, California. Robert is on our Republican line. Welcome.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for C-SPAN. I'm here in Silicon Valley, and I've been in China for about 6 years working back and forth, and also have been in the software outsourcing business. And, you know, one thing that's kind of ironical is the investment money that started Alibaba actually came out of, you know, the investment companies here in Silicon Valley. And there's a very large contingency of Chinese software engineers who work at Google, who work at Yahoo. There is such a integration between China and Silicon Valley. It's almost like the same hand, if you will. So, Robert, have you looked into this? Have you really seen the reality of our American investment companies that have invested in China, who actually have duplicated the Google model because that's you know, that's what they're doing?
So I think if I understand the question correctly, it's have I looked at the degree to which Silicon Valley and American investors have invested in China? Yes, I think on the whole, China is a huge market. It's an expanding market, and it's a very important market for our technology companies. And I think in no way would I guess that Google's act is going to show a further pullout of that market by other American companies. Microsoft has already stood up and said absolutely not. They're in China for the long haul. They're going to stay there, and they don't see the benefit to them as a company or to the Chinese dissidents if they pulled out.
Address the political issue on this a little bit. What sort of pressures does the administration feel? What do they have to do in response outside of what Google may do? What would the administration do? What would Congress want the administration to do in terms of defining U.S. business practices in other countries?
There's a bill before the House right now that would essentially ban American companies from doing business in any country that restricted the freedom of the internet. So that if you were a company that wanted to do business in China, you would not be able to acquiesce to their demands that you filter search results. I don't see that bill going very far. I think what has happened because of this is, one, on the censorship issue, President Obama had already raised that very quietly and very subtly with the Chinese in his visit. I think now he's going to raise that a lot less subtly, and I think Secretary Clinton is also going to raise that issue. I also think we will see some support coming out of Secretary Clinton's speech next week for developing an anti-censorship network that would allow Chinese dissidents and the Chinese public to get outside the Great Firewall of China and be able to access the rest of the internet uncensored. I also think this has created a lot more pressure on the issue of cyber espionage, particularly directed against the economy. This was something that was never on the president's agenda with China. It was never something that would be publicly discussed. Most that we understand is that the administration has quietly protested to the Chinese over certain hacking of government systems that they really find beyond the pale. I think now the issue of targeted espionage and the theft of intellectual property by the Chinese is going to become a major issue. Domestically, over the last year, the president and his administration has not wanted to tackle cybersecurity as an issue. It took almost a year to appoint a cyber czar, and during that time, there was a lot of concern that any move on cybersecurity could harm the economic competitiveness of companies like Google. I think now that seems a little ironic. I think now the issue of cybersecurity and helping the private sector to protect itself is going to become part of the Obama administration's platform.
John's our next caller. John in Traverse City, Michigan. Go ahead.
Good morning. I appreciate the numerous fora that come to be available on the call-in show here. I recall being initially a little bit on the disappointed side when I heard about Google's willingness to acquiesce to the censorship as a condition of their doing business in China. I believe it was something on really quite a noble experiment. However, in retrospect and with a little bit more distance from it personally, really my question would be for the guests and perhaps for other callers that it seems to me at this point Google has now given a taste of what I believe is the corporate culture of Google, the freedom of flow of information as evinced by the book thing, etc., as being something that if it goes away, then they will miss it and appreciate it to what extent it could have been a free, uncensored opportunity for learning, as the net really is. And really, my question would be then, don't you suppose, really, as a matter of, let's just call it world civics, that it would be a fine thing if it were to be the case that Google were to hold the line? I would say that would be a freedom-loving and patriotic type thing to do, although I don't want to introduce the concept of national patriotism here.
All right, John, we'll get a reply. Thanks.
I think Google is acting out of their self-interest in many ways by taking this stand. It's unlikely that China is going to cave, but I think it's become very important for Google and other internet companies to see the spread of the internet. There are about 1.5, 1.6 billion internet users today. Google continue to grow at the pace that it has grown, but only if that number continues to increase and taking up larger population of the planet. So I think Google needs to see an open, a free internet in order for their model of making the world's information available to the world's users.
Coral Springs, Florida, and this is Crystal on our Democrats line. Go ahead for Robert Kanaki.
Hi. I remember a few years ago when Google first entered China that there was a test you can do on a Chinese website for Tiananmen Square, and that you wouldn't be able to see the classic image of a young man standing in front of the tanks. So I just heard that they opened that up from C-SPAN earlier today and tried that test again on the Chinese version of Google, and it's now looks like the 7th most popular image search anyway, 7th most popular result for that phrase. So I was wondering what the likelihood was of the Chinese users of Google to maybe circumvent that firewall and find that image prior to the restrictions of Google.
I think that if you were a fairly fairly technically savvy user, though not an expert, and you had the means, you could circumvent the Great Firewall of China. You could do that through a virtual private network where essentially you would encrypt your traffic out to a server somewhere outside China in the United States or Europe, and then from there you could conduct search engines. So the capability to do that certainly existed. Again, I think most users in China just weren't motivated to do that, and doing so did violate the law. But it certainly was possible. The percentage of Chinese internet users who availed themselves of those services, I don't know.
Robert Knake, our guest, with the Council on Foreign Relations, talking about Google and China. About 15 more minutes of your calls to Savannah. Good morning to Daniel on our Independence line.
Yeah, I'd like to know what's the Chinese people's reaction to this, and as for the long-term future, what is this going to do to their access of information?
I think that the Chinese people's reaction has been fairly muted because news of the story has also been censored within China. I think certain populations have become aware of it, and so we've seen some beautiful demonstrations of users within China's love for Google and love for the information that they got through Google. They've lit candles, they've laid flowers outside Google's headquarters in China. Since then, the Chinese universities have banned that activity for their students and said that they would risk expulsion. So we've seen a lot of evidence that there are people within China, within that elite community of Google users, who really do love the service. I think there's very little chance that the Chinese government is going to acquiesce and say, okay, Google, you can be in China without any censorship. But I think over the long haul, this issue will start to undermine and threaten the Chinese Communist Party's control over the country. I think since Tiananmen, there has been something of a deal with the Chinese elite and with the Communist Party, which is we won't ask for democracy, we won't demand freedom like we did in '89, as long as our economy continues to improve and as long as our daily life and our standing in the world grows. I think in this instance, there's the potential that some Chinese elites are going to start saying, hey, wait a second, you really are starting to impact our national competitiveness. If we don't have freedom of information, if I can't Google the same way that an American can Google, that hurts me, and I don't like that.
What sort of role did the Summer Olympics in 2008 have in sort of expanding the awareness of searches, of information available?
I think that in 2008, the Chinese government did open up a lot of portals. They also put a lot more restrictions on their own people. So they were able to, I think, create something of a facade where foreigners traveled in, they had access to foreign sites, but a lot of Chinese population didn't. The Chinese have incredible control over their portions of the internet. When there were riots in a region of China, China was able to cut off internet access for 6 months to the entire region, everyone in it. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the degree of control that they do have over their internal web.
And on that point, the New York Times reports this morning that China has restored text messaging in Xinjiang, is the name of the province. The Chinese government continued to ease its 6-month-old blackout on communications in the northwest region by restoring some texting messages on Sunday. That's according to the state news media. Next up, San Diego and Manny on our Republican line. Good morning. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just not buying this. I mean, Google has been absolutely wretched in its dealings with China. They were hand in glove with the central government in establishing the Great Firewall of China. The reason Google is reacting to this intrusion is because their future revenue growth stream is going to be based on cloud computing. And cloud computing requires a secure and encrypted database because it's going to be their growth stream. They're willing to walk away from the billions that they threw at the Chinese investment because of more billions are at stake in Google. And I'm just not buying any of this spin.
He used a term there, cloud computing. In response to his question, can you explain what that is all about?
Sure. Well, cloud computing is the idea that instead of storing data on your desktop or on a server at your work, that instead you'd store it up in the cloud on servers that are owned and controlled by a company like Google or Microsoft. It has a tremendous cost benefit, and it also can really increase collaboration. And Google has really been trying to sell these products through their Google Enterprise. That's one of the areas of Google that we know is heavily targeted. What the caller has raised is an issue that many cybersecurity officials have said is this an incidence where Google's raising the censorship issue, they're leaving China essentially as a red herring to distract from the fact that their systems were insecure and compromised? I don't believe that argument, and the main reason for that is one, Google did not have to acknowledge to the world that they had been hacked and that they had data loss. Most companies don't disclose that fact, either publicly or to the government. In this case, Google did both. They informed the U.S. government and the FBI in December, and this last week they went public globally with it. So if they had wanted to protect their reputation and their security, the best way to do that would have been to have said nothing.
Stanton, Michigan. Good morning, Becky, on our Democrats line.
Good morning. I just wanted to say go Google, because I remember when Microsoft first went into China, and I heard that they were going to go along with all this, you know, not putting certain things on the search engine. And I just couldn't believe American companies, especially Microsoft. They do so many good things. And, you know, to think that they were actually going to go along with this. And I feel the same way, I guess, about Google originally doing it. But what they're doing now, I say go, you know, and I just hope they don't get hurt by it. I will stand by them any way I can, because it is just wrong, wrong, wrong for people not to be able to know things.
Next up is Runnymede, New Jersey. Adam on our Independence line. Go ahead.
How you guys doing today?
Fine, thanks.
My first question is, could you explain the Green Dam or the Great Firewall? I heard that on the news a couple weeks ago and can't really figure out what that is. And also, is your member or is your current speaker a member of the Bilderberg Group, or has he ever attended any of their meetings? Thank you.
Great Firewall question, if you want.
Sure. The Great Firewall and the Green Dam Youth Escort are two different programs. The Great Firewall of China, it's really a moniker that we've applied to what the Chinese have done in the West, but essentially they've taken their portions of the internet, and at the points where it leaves their country, they've placed controls on those routers so that they can screen all traffic inbound and outbound through the country and eliminate speech that they find offensive, block websites that they find offensive, screen for pornography. Green Dam Youth Escort was a program that they wanted put on every new PC that would be sold in China, including PCs made by American companies like Dell, HP, and Apple. And it would have essentially been a censorship technology on the desktop. It would have given the Chinese control over basically any new desktop sold in the country.
And a user wouldn't be able to override that.
And a user would not be able to override that. What it turned out was that the software had a lot of vulnerabilities in it, and it probably would have reduced China's cybersecurity overall rather than increased it.
To Laredo, Texas, and Robert, good morning on our Republican line.
Good morning. I'd like to make a comment about the Chinese. I'm 81 years old, and I'm a Korean veteran, and I fought over there against the Chinese. That I can remember so plainly. They would send these Korean citizens out, blowing their bugles, and after we fire through them, here comes the Chinese. They ran it. We didn't win Korea because of the Chinese, and we lost in Vietnam. The Chinese, my brother was in Vietnam. The Chinese ran us out of there.
Robert, thanks for your call this morning. Albuquerque, New Mexico. John on our Democrats line. Go ahead for Robert Kanaki.
Hey, thank you for taking my call. First, thanks to that Korean veteran. Without guys like that, we wouldn't be free. What does this have to do with them being able to ship their goods in here? I know the State Department got involved with Nike situation. You know, these shoe sellers like Epifa.com and Shoesy.com are selling shoes that are made in the Nike factories, but they didn't get the licensure through Beaverton, Oregon. And all of your golf manufacturers are angry because, you know, they'll come out with an expensive set of clubs and they'll produce the same, it looks like comes from the same factory with a generic name, and sell them cheaply on eBay or on other sites that come out of China on the internet. You know, free trade ought to be for everybody, not just these big corporations.
Thank you, John. We'll get a response.
I think the caller's right. There is something related to those issues. This is, at heart, separate from the censorship issue, an issue of theft of intellectual property, where Chinese companies or Chinese individuals or the Chinese government have been perpetrating attacks against American companies trying to steal their intellectual property and taking the designs for everything from fighter jets to pharmaceuticals off of companies' servers, bringing it back to China, and then producing goods in China without having to pay the development costs themselves or without having to license the development. So I think it is a very much related issue, and I think on the whole, the security of the supply chain is something that will increasingly be important, where we are importing goods from China that may contain spyware, malware, and things like digital cameras, pocket thumb drives, and other electronics that may be compromised before you've even plugged them into your computer and gotten them on the web.
Next up, Drexel, Missouri, Stephanie. Go ahead.
My name's Stefan.
Stefan, I'm sorry, Stefan. Go ahead with your comment for Robert Knake.
Yes. My question is, what's with all the trying to cover up what they're doing over there in China? Why all the security and all the blocks and everything? What are they trying to hide over there?
I am not a China expert, but my understanding is that the Chinese government fears that too much information, too much information on democracy, too much external influence could destabilize the country and hurt their power base. A lot of totalitarian and authoritarian regimes have been afraid of the internet since it came online. And I think in countries like North Korea, they've made the decision simply to completely restrict access to the internet. Very few people in North Korea have any internet access at all. And those that do, they can only go to a couple websites within the country, like the Dear Leaders homepage. China has taken a more open approach where they've said, we see value in the internet and giving our citizens internet access, but on a very limited basis, simply because they want to maintain their power and maintain their economic growth without having any kind of popular revolts or democratic distractions.
The CNET News wrote, Tom Krasett wrote a piece on Friday about, or Thursday of last week, about Google's peers mulling their options in China, other businesses in China. What sort of considerations are businesses like, like other Microsoft, or even Yahoo to its limited extent, or other businesses considering now in the wake of these this conflict between Google and China?
Well, I think a lot of people have raised the issue of Microsoft, where Microsoft has come out very clearly and said they don't support Google's action and they're going to stay in the market. The Bing search engine, which hasn't caught on very well in China thus far, I think Google has opened the door for Microsoft to move in with Bing there, and they're going to make a heavy push to become that #2 search engine behind the local Baidu. I think the issue for most American companies isn't so much about what they sell in the Chinese market, but whether or not their security is good enough to prevent their intellectual property from being stolen. And I think when they look at their mainland China operations, they're going to be increasingly concerned about whether that's a place that their intellectual property is slipping out into their competitors' hands.
One more call here. It's Lexington, Kentucky, and Malika on our Democrats line. Malika, make sure you mute your television or radio or your feedback and go ahead with your question or comments.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I think you all had a guest on that called in a businessman that had moved his business to China. And inspectors were to come into the business, and the workers were told that they only worked 5 days a week, 40 hours a day, when in reality they worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, you know. And he was very unhappy, but moving to China was the only way he could make money. I am behind Google if they pull out of China just to make a statement. They're a communist country. They're known for piracy, and I think it's high time that companies not tolerate that totalitarianism, even over the American companies.
Any final thoughts?
I think that in the coming weeks, we're going to really see this issue play out a lot more. I'm not sure we're going to learn a lot more about what happened to Google or what happened to these other countries, but I think we're going to see the Chinese respond and take some action, either to block Google CN completely or to restrict the search terms in some other way. And then I think we will probably see the State Department respond with a tech strategy that really is going to give, hopefully, people living in these kinds of regimes access to a free, unfettered internet.
Robert Knake with the Council on Foreign Relations, thanks for coming by this morning.
Thanks for having me.
That'll about do it for this morning's Washington Journal. Back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern for more of your calls and comments. And we hope you enjoy the rest of this Martin Luther King Day holiday. We'll see you tomorrow.